battling with this thought in my head, thinking that others are gonna know what little crack or crevice makes you cringe. It's hard to realize that what may sound like a squeaky, out of tune, irritating violin to someone sounds like the most serene, beautiful tone. You know, that's why those old records were so great back in the day. It's because there's no way that you could go back and Pro Tool it, slice it, dice it, do this and fix that and fix that. All the imperfections were left there, but really they weren't imperfections. Some of the greatest moments of guitar playing and singing is to hear somebody's pipe screaming, trying to get to that note, and you can hear the rage, and then or overshooting a note. It's like just overexcited, man. That is emotion. That is a live human being. The live feel, the honesty blows away computer technology and what perfect truly is, if there is such a thing. I'm against it all, man. Let it all hang out.
This outfit was a band that absolutely dominated their time in the spotlight. From 1990 to their end in 2003, they were one of heavy metal's greatest torchbearers. Their name is etched alongside the likes of Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, and Metallica, and their influence not only preserved heavy metal during the tumultuous age of alternative rock, but also left an indelible mark on the genre. But don't mistake their accomplishments as mere happenstance. The roots of their timeless classics trace back to their formative years. Vinnie, Paul, and Darrell Abbott nurtured their musical talents from early childhood, and the crucible of the 1980s was where they tirelessly forged their craft, culminating in the magnum opus, Cowboys From Hell. Today, we invite you to join us on an in-depth exploration of the saga of one of heavy metal's most formidable titans, and the tragedy that ended it permanently. I'm going to walk you through the highs and lows, the triumphs and failures, and throw in a few stories that perhaps you haven't heard or would be delighted to hear again. This is the Hawk and Load history of Pantera. Pantera returned to monstrous applause in late 2022 on a stage in South America. It was the band's first show in over 2 decades, and if you ask most of the people who attended, I would be willing to bet that they'd tell you it was a fantastic experience. If you take to social media, a raging debate consumes the conversation around this legendary groove metal outfit. Is it a tribute? Is it Pantera? Is it an issue that it goes against the explicit wishes of the man who named the band? That's for you to decide for yourself at the end of the day. How much of what Pantera was, and still is, do Darrell and Vinnie Paul Abbott have a claim to? In September of 2022, I posted a video on the death of Dimebag Darrell. It was intended not for an audience of metalheads, but for an audience that would be interested in the criminal mind of the man who took his life from the perspective of a metalhead. That's not the audience it found, however. As a brief aside, I won't be going in-depth into the event itself, as it was a tough thing to dive headfirst into. If you're interested, the video will be in the description and at the end screen once you marathon through this one. In that video, I couldn't help but provide commentary speaking on my personal feelings about what Pantera means to me. At the end of the day, that's all I have the authority to do. I explained that the legend of Pantera is the sum of its parts. Dime, Vin, Rex, and Phil come together to make a magic happen that you will almost certainly never see again. Pantera's history spans a lot farther back than you may think, but their impact is certainly one that you're aware of if you've stumbled across this video. The influence they had on heavy metal continues to ripple through headbanger culture, and their legacy is undeniably concrete. But the Abbott's name was so integral to what Pantera was and how they're remembered that there's really no better place to start than with Darrell and Vinnie Paul. Vinnie Paul Abbott was born March 11, 1964, to his parents, country music songwriter and producer Jerry Abbott, and mother Carolyn. Vinnie Paul wasn't an only child for long, however. Just over 2 years later, the Abbotts would welcome their second son, Darrell, into the world. With the boys being so close in age, they shared something that only close siblings would be able to relate to or articulate. Even though Jerry and Carolyn Abbott divorced in 1979, after 17 years of marriage, the boys grew up in an environment that fostered passion. They were encouraged by their father to chase whatever it was they had a fire for. In their youth, Darrell looked up to his big brother Vinnie, as most younger siblings do. When Vin played youth football, Darrell would even try out for the team despite being small and not built for it. It didn't work out. As teenagers, the most cherished of interests for the Abbott brothers was music. Van Halen, Kiss, Judas Priest, and Black Sabbath. The boys followed a heavy metal journey, coming of age right alongside the genre itself. Vinnie Paul's first record was Kiss Alive. Their father, Jerry, being in the music business himself, not only encouraged his boys, but was a big influence and mentor for them. Darrell Abbott picked up the guitar at 12 years old, and by all accounts was a complete natural. But beyond his natural ability, Darrell worked extremely hard to not only improve his playing, but to come up with sounds and styles that people hadn't heard before. Darrell would excel to the point where he won his iconic Dean ML in a guitar competition. It would subsequently be banned from future participation for being so good at it, it wasn't fair. Legendary stuff. Vinnie Paul originally played the tuba, but with few career prospects for a tuba player, his father recommended the drums and bought him his first kit. He was influenced by drummers like the late John Bonham of Led Zeppelin and Peter Criss of Kiss. The Abbott brothers grew up in music in a way that not many siblings do. Instead of a rivalry, they fostered a chemistry that really is something special. They accented one another in such a way that the boys were nearly one entity. By 1981, while they were still teenagers, Darrell and Vinnie Paul started the band that would go on to cement their legacy, Pantera. In 1981, the Abbotts started their band proper with Gemini, a name inspired by bands like Journey and Heart. Further name changes would take place before finally settling on Pantera, after a high school bandmate suggested the name to Vinnie Paul. The original lineup was a 5-piece featuring the Abbotts alongside Donnie Hart on vocals, Tommy Bradford on bass, and Terry Glaze on guitar. Hart would depart the band early on, and Terry Glaze would step in as the band's vocalist. Pantera emulated their heroes in true Abbott fashion, from the leather and spikes of Judas Priest to the glam and spandex of Kiss. The Abbotts and Pantera would build their beginnings as a product of the time, aiming to be just like the legendary acts that inspired their music. Darrell and Vinnie Paul would begin to build the larger-than-life personas that they would eventually be immortalized as. In 1982, Bradford would be replaced by a classmate and fellow high school jazz band member, Rex Brown. Rex Robert Brown was born July 27, 1964. He lost his father when he was just 7 years old, and he grew up being raised by his mother and sister. His introduction to music was with the piano, learning ragtime tunes and classical pieces. As a lot of youth in the 70s did, Brown fell in love with acts like ZZ Top and Def Leppard early on. At 12 years old, Rex picked up the bass guitar and fostered a love for heavy metal and hard rock, analogous to his Abbott counterparts. Brown played the bass in the high school jazz band alongside Vinnie Paul. Early in Pantera's history, he was recruited to the band that would lead to his name in lights, fame and fortune, and a cemented legacy that would be unshakable. He adopted the stage moniker Rex Rocker. As I've stated a few times, Pantera emulated their idols, donning glitz and glam stage attire and dated 80s aliases. Staying inside the Texas border, the band would tour and constantly play local clubs. And in 1983, the collective was primed and ready to release their debut studio album, Metal Magic, through their record label dubbed Metal Magic Records. Jerry Abbott, ever the patriarch, would produce the album. The opening track sets a tone of emulation as a clear homage to Kiss. The over-the-top album cover and hilarious track titles like album opener Ride My Rocket were certainly a product of the time, as well as the band beginning the journey to find themselves. In the future, they would be embarrassed by not only Metal Magic, but seemingly the entire 1980s set of releases, but there's a great lesson to learn from it. The first time you make anything, it sucks. It's awful, and there's no way around it. That's not saying Metal Magic is bad, it isn't, but to the band that produced it, it was a far cry from their true potential sound and image. Subjectively, the album can be many things to many people, but from the perspective of a creator, you're going to hate your early work. There's no way around it, and you have to get it out of the way if you want to get to the good stuff. From the jump, Diamond Darrell Abbott, as he would be credited for the next decade, had that fire. He was more than capable on the guitar, and his unique sound and soul can be felt right from the beginning. The solos are easily identifiable as coming from the legend himself, and the music is pretty awesome. Metal Magic is the beginning of an era that the band would later bury, but it's loosely defined by vocalist Terry Glaze. Terry Glaze was a friend of original bassist Tommy Bradford. He met Bradford after hearing him and his friends jamming in their garage down the road and deciding to knock on the door. Bradford and Glaze later chose to be involved with something a bit heavier, and Bradford, playing in the high school jazz band with Vinnie led to the very early formation of Pantera. Glaze originally joined Pantera as a second guitarist, but after Donnie Hart left the band, he assumed that role as well. Glaze's heavy metal preference was for Sunset Strip glam acts like Motley Crue and Rad. By the introduction of Metal Magic, Pantera was a four-piece outfit. The album was the official starting point of the band and showcased, more than anything, that the boys had potential. Work had been put into improving the instrumentals, and by 1984, the band released their sophomore album, Projects in the Jungle. It was a clear step up from their debut and showcased heavier riffs and instrumentals, and in retrospect, you can hear the clear direction the band was headed. What is also fairly apparent is the divide between Terry Glaze's cliché glam metal tropes and the more thrash metal flavor that the Abbotts were grinding towards. The record was released under their label once more, and the band would even go on to produce a music video for the track All Over Tonight. Bands like Metallica, Exodus, and Slayer had begun to grow in the heavy metal underground through the early to mid-80s, and by 1986 were fully established powerhouse bands with releases like Rain and Blood and Master of Puppets. It was a sound that drew Darrell, Vinnie, and Rex towards it, while Glaze continued to go all in on the glam metal glory. The club circuit at the time was tricky for upcoming acts like Pantera. Club owners preferred that bands played covers of already established hits, with original tunes taking a major backseat. Pantera was able to gain a following slowly but steadily, introducing their original tunes to the setlist, but getting the attention of any major labels was futile, it seemed. Thankfully, Jerry Abbott's ability as a producer and connections to the industry allowed the band to self-publish and manage. But their lack of major label clout made it difficult for the band to break out among the saturated glam metal market. In 1985, the band released their third studio album, I Am the Night, featuring similar lockstep with their improvements through the first two records. The riffs get even heavier, Diamond Darrell is on point with the guitar leads, and Terry Glaze remains true to his glam metal influences. The record would sell roughly 25,000 copies and birthed their second music video for the track Hot and Heavy. The divide between Glaze and the rest of the band was not only clear in the music, but was clear to the young men themselves. Shortly after the release of I Am the Night, Terry Glaze departed Pantera, beginning the hunt for a new lead vocalist. The Terry Glaze era of Pantera was officially over. With the departure of vocalist Terry Glaze leaving a vacant frontman spot open for Pantera, the band began auditioning new ones. A few singers would officially fill the slot and play shows with Brown and the Abbotts, however, be it lacking ability to match Glaze's vocal range or cultural differences, none of the replacements were working out at all. Philip H. Anselmo was born in July of 1968 in New Orleans, Louisiana. He bounced around many schools throughout his youth, deciding to drop out of high school in his senior year. His father owned and operated a restaurant just outside of New Orleans that thrived well enough until Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In 1985, when he was just 17 years old, he joined a local band named Rapid Phase. He wasn't particularly excited about their glam-flavored direction, but was determined to take advantage of the opportunity after the band became disillusioned with their previous vocalist. Anselmo's biggest influences were Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, and Iron Maiden, as well as the burgeoning class of thrash metal acts like Slayer and new wave of British heavy metal legends like Venom. Phil's tastes wandered further away from the glamorous hair bands that were dominating heavy metal culture at the time, but Phil was more than capable of fitting into that role vocally. Rapid Phase would later be renamed Razor White and would tour locally through the club circuits in Louisiana and Texas. Retrospectively, Anselmo admitted his time with the band was crucial in shaping his style, stage presence, and career, but that the band wasn't very good. As mentioned earlier, club owners wanted bands to cater to the times, so a lot of what Razor White performed were covers of popular established tunes. After only a year, Anselmo became disillusioned with Razor White's direction and began to explore options. By the grace of serendipity, Texas-based headbangers Pantera were in a similar spot, desperately searching for a vocalist that would fit them and their ambitions. Pantera's legend had spread far and wide throughout Texas and Louisiana, and they were underground favorites of fans and fellow musicians alike. Diamond Darrell Abbott was already a noted prodigy, even back then, but to a contained demographic. 1987 saw Phil Anselmo coming together with Dime, Vin, and Rex. Pantera was on a path to a heavier sound, and finding the right guy for the job had been difficult for them. After a jam session with Phil, he would depart back to Louisiana only to have Darrell give him a ring and invite him back to be their permanent vocalist. According to Anselmo, the band had begun to backslide and fans began to lose interest in the phase between Glaze and his joining the band. They needed to build back their fan base, but with their shifting sound, it was inevitable and ultimately built a stronger foundation. The next year in 1988, Pantera released their fourth studio album, Power Metal. Just like the others, it was released under their Metal Magic Records, but unlike the others, it showcased a massive shift in the band's sound. With Anselmo's voice lending hand to heavier instrumentals, the band began to incorporate a groove that would later define an entirely new subgenre of heavy metal. Along with upgraded production quality and expected technical improvements, Power Metal is a great album, and I don't know why they don't acknowledge it along with their legendary follow-up records. Unlike the glam-heavy albums they released with Terry Glaze, Power Metal, fittingly, felt more like Judas Priest than Motley Crue. With Rob Halford being a heavy inspiration to a young Phil Anselmo, his vocals certainly showed it. The riffs were heavier and the solos were signature Diamond Darrell Abbott. Pantera had finally found a lane that they loved, and they gunned down that lane at full speed.
Metal, yeah!
In the 1980s club days, owners wouldn't bother with bands that didn't have the look or right cover tunes on their setlist. The glam, glitter, hairspray, and spandex were effectively required for bands to even get their time on stage. With the rise of bands like Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth, Pantera realized they no longer needed to fit the hair metal image. Along with their change in musical style, their attire would follow suit, with Vinnie Paul noting that, "The clothes don't make the music, we do." And feeling the most comfortable on stage became the priority. They had paid their dues and had enough recognition to get their time on stage, and from spandex to denim, Pantera began to form the image they're known for today. I feel that I should step in here with a bit of clarification and commentary. These albums and the history that coincides with them are very important to the development and future of Pantera. Pantera's studio releases, as it stands now, excludes these records. The band would effectively restart the clock on their career with the release of their next record, Cowboys From Hell.
On the album situation, where we look at it, we got two really great albums. Those are the only two we care to talk about, and those rip, and that's Power Metal and, of course, Cowboys From Hell. So if you find any of that old stuff, as a collector's item and keep it in your back pocket.
The Cowboys record is the product of us growing together and being Pantera as it really is, you know? Right. You know, aggressive, you know?
Pantera had been turned down repeatedly by every major label in the game. By 1989, they were well into their shifting sound from glam metal to thrash and groove metal. Atco Records executive Derek Shulman had grown an interest in signing the band and sent 2 of his representatives to see the band perform live. The reps were so impressed with Pantera that they made a call the same evening of the show, suggesting that Atco sign them, and the deal was approved. By the end of the first song, my jaw was on the floor. The sonic power of it all, the attitude and musicianship blew me away. You had to be an idiot to not think they're amazing. I mean, how could you see these guys and not think, holy shit? Pantera was finally getting their shot at a major label outing, and in late 1989, they began production on their 5th record. In the summer of 1990, Pantera released Cowboys From Hell, marking the official death of their 80s run and beginning of a legendary reign of terror. The members acknowledged that this is their true debut album, with Pantera feeling that they finally had the chance to make the record they wanted to make. In the present day, surface-level fans of Pantera often mistake Cowboys From Hell as the band's debut, and that seems to be purposefully perpetuated. Cowboys From Hell is a heavy metal staple and a certified classic. From the title track to Domination to Cemetery Gates, the record has some of metal's greatest compositions. The album would be the band's breakthrough, with it landing at number 27 on the Billboard charts. Critical reception was positive, and the album would go on to shape heavy metal itself as it evolved through the 1990s. The band would embark on a tour that year to support the record, with it even leading them to 1991's Monsters of Rock show, on a bill with acts like Metallica and AC/DC, in front of an astonishing number of attendees in Moscow. It was just before the fall of the Soviet Union, and numbers reported were anywhere between 500,000 to 2 million. Regardless of the actual number, it's one of heavy metal's most legendary outings. The marked shift in Pantera's sound and look is perhaps best represented by the cover of Cowboys From Hell. The content within elevated this cover right along with it, and with all 4 members featured in various states of unruly hell-raising, the most legendary of them has to be Dime and his iconic Dean from Hell. The story of Dimebag Darrell's Dean M.L. is just as legendary as any other facet of Pantera's legacy. In the early 80s, a young Darrell Abbott displayed a remarkable talent on the electric guitar, and he would win the Dean ML in a guitar competition. Originally, the guitar was a completely stock ML with a burgundy finish. The ML was the second Dean guitar that he would get that day, with his father ordering one for him as well in a cherry burst finish. But with 2 Dean MLs and lacking a Pontiac Firebird, Dime decided to sell the prized guitar for $600. Originally, Dime tried to sell the guitar to Buddy Blaze, a friend and soon-to-be renowned guitar modifier. But knowing how much Dime loved that guitar, he decided it wouldn't be right to take it from him, even attempting to talk Darrell out of selling it at all.
Long story short, I sold the guitar, the 101, and I got $600. I got a car, but I sure missed that guitar. And man, through the whole way, through that whole cycle of all that time that I sat around thinking, man, I should have did something else to get this car. I should have lost that great guitar. Rhyming with Diamond, coming again.
After Blaze found out that Darrell sold the guitar anyway, he decided to buy it himself from the new owner, and over the years, added a lot of the modifications that it's known for now, like the Floyd Rose and the Lightning Bolt paint job. He held on to it, sure that Dime would want it back eventually, and when the time was right, he gifted it back to Dime. The timeline for all of this is kind of vague, but he got the guitar back sometime roughly in 1987, as seen in some of the footage that I've chosen to showcase. The success of Cowboys From Hell would lead Darrell to an official but short-lived endorsement deal from Dean Guitars themselves, and he would continue using the Dean From Hell for Pantera's next outing.
Next thing I knew, the next day on my doorstep, FedEx was a big box. I opened it up, and I seen the case, and I kind of fucking, I totally knew it was a Dean in there. And I popped it open. I was like, how could he do something this quick? I popped it open, and it was the Lightning Bolt, Dime Bolt, Dean from fucking Hell, man. And I was like, holy shit. Greatest guitar I ever had, will ever have my whole life.
By 1991, the band entered Pantego Sound Studio once more, looking to capture lightning in a bottle twice. They ended up capturing the entire storm instead. Before their show in Moscow, the band began recording the tracks for Vulgar Display of Power. At this stage, Darrell dropped the Diamond moniker in favor of his now immortalized Dimebag one, with Vulgar Display of Power being his final album credited as Diamond Darrell. It would symbolize the central theme of the band's transformation into the Pantera that they wanted to be. Vulgar Display of Power began with a title, and the rest came easy for the band. Looking to capture their raw live feeling and be an outlet for an angry demographic, Pantera wanted to make heavy metal music, and that's exactly what they did. Vulgar Display of Power was released in February of 1992, and catching lightning in a bottle is a fitting analogy. They were hoping to recapture and one-up Cowboys From Hell, and that's exactly what they did. The album's critical reception was overwhelmingly positive, with Darrell's guitar work being a notable contributor to the record's success. The band was riding a high, and it was just the beginning. The record was a further evolution for the band, and the tracks aside, its cover is one of heavy metal's most legendary. How it came to be has been told quite a few different ways, so I'll do my best to cover it all. Band members, most notably Vinnie Paul, maintain that they chose a random guy off the street and paid him to be punched in the face for the album's cover. He was hit around 30 times for $10 a pop. In some instances, he even claims Anselmo was the one to throw the punches. Cowboys From Hell's equally iconic cover was shot by photographer Brad Geiss. So when it came time to produce the follow-up, they gave him a call once again. The band knew they wanted the cover to be someone getting rocked in the face, putting an image to the record's title and aggressive tonal shift. According to Geiss, the real story is that a male model was hired, Sean Cross. It was all professionally and intentionally set up to look and feel like a real punch, but in the end, no one got hit. This story is a great example of the Abbott's commitment to their larger-than-life personas. Charismatic personalities that they knew people were looking for and looking up to, and they were determined to live up to the hype. In support of Vulgar's release, Pantera was drafted for a tour with mainstream acts like Skid Row, exposing them to the larger headbanger community. That was followed up with a European tour with thrash metal legends Megadeth. One notable controversy to rise from the tour would be the lawsuit facing Phil Anselmo after a fan was jumped in the crowd. According to Phil, a Megadeth fan was incessantly spewing hate toward the band and Phil himself, and it eventually grew to be too much for the surrounding Pantera fans. The Megadick's father would later go on to sue Anselmo, claiming that he instigated the attack and even that he joined in on it himself. In a phone call to the band's manager, he said something to the effect of, "I'd like 5 minutes alone with that Phil Anselmo." The manager replied, "No, you don't." It was a massive headache that would be immortalized in Pantera's next record, a record that would immortalize the boys themselves. Heavy metal through the 1990s gave way to alternative rock bands. Bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Stone Temple Pilots ruled the airwaves, and heavy, aggressive metal was back on the island of misfit toys by the time 1994 came around. With Metallica's mega-successful self-titled record, a more commercial sound was dominating the space, and it seemed like attitude was taking a back seat for the earlier part of the decade. Pantera's exposure to new audiences through constant tours with peers like White Zombie, Slayer, and Exodus, as well as their commitment to blowing the roof off of the venue each show, was paying off. It was a routine that they were more than used to given their 80s outings, but the audience was much bigger and primed for the sound that only Pantera could bring them. Their last two records were an attempt to harness that live energy and put it down on wax. They had also pioneered a subgenre, with groove metal firmly established as a powerhouse of the times. So in 1993, the band entered the studio at Abtract's recording in Nashville, Tennessee, and assembled the third in a trilogy of now legendary albums. Far Beyond Driven was released in March of 1994 and peaked at number 1 on the charts, becoming the band's fastest-selling album. A feat that, despite everything Pantera had thrown into making the record, not even they thought would happen. It cemented their direction, domination, and legacy at a time when the youth were looking for an outlet. The album is heavy and aggressive, but bookended with a cover of Black Sabbath's Planet Caravan, almost as a way to bring you back to baseline. The album was the first the band would release through Elektra Records, joining an alumni of other massive acts. Far Beyond Driven made it clear to the music world that heavy metal was not only in abundant supply, but welcomed by an audience that craved it. Dean guitars had been a Dimebag staple for some time, but by 1994 the company had gone under, prompting Washburn to court a decade-long endorsement deal with the established guitar legend. Both brands, together with painstaking pickiness on Darrell's front, would release an array of signature models, starting with the Dime 333 in 1995. Dime would be seen with Washburn for the remainder of Pantera's tenure, but by the end of Far Beyond Driven's cycle, the band was beginning to see its first taste of turmoil. After returning from touring in support of their mega-hit album Far Beyond Driven, vocalist Phil Anselmo began to display an array of odd behaviors, including a noticeable distancing from his fellow brothers and bandmates. By the end of that tour, Phil complained of unmanageable back pain from years of intense stage presence. He attempted to cope with booze, but noted that it was affecting his performance and was beginning to make his bandmates concerned. After consulting with physicians, they believed that surgery could help alleviate his pain, but advised that the recovery could take an amount of time that Anselmo was not willing to take away from Pantera. He instead began to use as a means to cope with the pain, opening the door to a battle that would plague the legendary frontman for years to come. To rewind a bit, in 1991, Phil Anselmo embarked on a side project, a supergroup of stellar musicians like Corrosion of Conformity's Pepper Keenan, dubbed Down. They put together a set of demos to circulate in the underground, and while with their respective bands would hand out copies to build a fan base. In 1995, the group got together to release their debut album, which performed very well. It was supported by a 13-date tour, after which members returned to their main projects. By 1999, Pantera bassist Rex Brown would be brought into the fold. Back home in Texas, Dimebag Darrell began and completed construction on a studio in his Dallas home. Pantera continued to put together riffs and arrangements for their next record, and Dime, Rex, and Vinnie Paul would eventually lay down the instrumentals for the Great Southern Trendkill in the home studio. Anselmo, however, would record his vocal tracks at Trent Reznor's studio in New Orleans. While the band still wrote the material together, the construction of the album was a departure from their previous methods and seemed to contribute to a mighty sound and raw presence. The Great Southern Trendkill was released in May of 1996, and while it had a lot to live up to given the band's last three juggernaut albums, it did manage to hit the spot for critics and fans alike. In the present day, when I talk about Pantera, and I talk about Pantera a lot, people will opine their love for this record, declaring it the best work the band ever produced. In July of 1996, just 2 months following the record's release, while on tour with White Zombie and I Hate God, Anselmo overdosed on heroin after a homecoming performance in Texas. As a result, Anselmo was dead for 4 to 5 minutes, and once paramedics arrived and administered either adrenaline or Narcan, he was revived and sent to the hospital. It would mark a major turning point in Anselmo's outlook on life, but also his relationship with the rest of Pantera.
I think it shook everybody else up. I was in bliss, actually. I was gone. Don't remember anything. And when you come out of something like that and you wake up, A, embarrassed, B, you see how it affects everybody around you. Just those two elements right there, there's no way that could ever happen again.
The immediate follow-up, as well as the years preceding Trendkill's release, the band would embark on tour after tour on some of the biggest stages in the game. In 1997, the band released their first live album, Official Live 101 Proof, which saw the record charting at number 15 on the Billboard 200 and marked down yet another success for Pantera. The album even included some new material that was hastily recorded mid-tour and included with the release. While the band would continue together, respective members would venture out into further side projects, most notably Phil Anselmo. He expanded his resume with alias appearances with Necrophagia and Viking Crown under the name Anton Crowley. At the other end, Rex, Dime, and Vinnie Paul would team with David Allan Coe in a Southern metal side gig dubbed Rebel Meets Rebel. All the while, Pantera was geared up to lay down one final record, whether they were aware of its finality or not. While the unorthodox recording method of the Great Southern Trendkill appears to be cracks in the foundation in hindsight, The album's success and Pantera's continued domination of the 1990s would have fans and critics assured of their solidarity. In 1999, the band gathered once more in the studio, this time without producer Terry Date. Date was somewhat of Pantera's secret ingredient and was a big contributor to the band's albums and success, from Cowboys From Hell to the Great Southern Trendkill. Reinventing the Steel was released in March of 2000, hitting number 4 on the charts and spawning a plethora of praise and accolades, from favorable critical reviews to Grammy nominations. The title was fitting, as it was a step forward for Pantera, yet harkened back to releases like Vulgar Display of Power, and fans loved it. At the time, it was simply a continuation of Pantera's decade of domination. Following the album's release, Pantera embarked on a supporting tour, featuring on the main stage of Ozfest 2000. Afterward, the band planned a tour of their own, but it was postponed due to Anselmo suffering an injury. But in 2001, they returned to the stage with the Extreme Steel Tour, leading into a planned European outing that would be cut short due to the September 11th attacks. After 9/11, the landscape of the United States was changed dramatically. It almost felt like the entire world was on pause, and Pantera was no exception. Fortunately, the band was stronger than ever, and these titans of heavy metal were just getting started. Just getting started. And these titans of heavy metal were just getting started. And these titans of heavy metal were just getting started. And these titans of heavy metal were just getting started. We're just getting started. And that was it. Reinventing the Steel was the end. They weren't just getting started. It was all over, but the finality of it was unclear to the fans and, more importantly, to Darrell and Vinnie Paul Abbott. For years, they attempted to reach out to Phil to put a plan together for Pantera, but their calls went unanswered. They watched as Phil and Rex released the next Down record and read in the metal rags about Anselmo and Superjoint Ritual. Phil was out there doing his thing, which Diamond Vin never minded in the past, but what about Pantera? Darrell and Vinnie Paul officially disbanded Pantera in 2003, 22 years after its inception and following 2 decades of domination and the only band the Abbotts had ever known. Seeing that Anselmo wasn't interested in taking calls or communicating, they accepted the obvious implications and closed the doors officially. Diamond Vin missed the stage in the studio. They missed being out there with the fans, in the crowd, and being one with the audience no matter how titanic their legend grew. And if they couldn't be out there with Pantera, then they were going to do it with Damageplan. The end of Pantera wasn't a clean break. The band's dirty laundry was being aired in interviews and online forums, with Anselmo expressing his apparent disdain for Dimebag Darrell in the now infamous Metal Hammer interview, an interview that we'll come back to in a bit. Diamond Vin recruited vocalist Pat Lockman and bassist Bob Zilla and entered the studio with Damageplan. Their debut record, Newfound Power, would release in February of 2004 and was a commercial success. It was going to be an uphill battle to sell this new project to Pantera fans, but it was off to a great start and they embarked on a supporting tour, playing small clubs much like they did countless times in the past. Damageplan should have a history just as deep and successful as Pantera. Anything that Dimebag Darrell and Vinnie Paul Abbott were creating was going to be worth listening to, and I wish that I could tell you that they would go on to take over the world. But I can't, and you know why I can't.
Details on that gunman who opened fire at a nightclub in Columbus, Ohio. Police say 25-year-old Nathan Gale jumped the stage as the group Damageplan started playing.
We may never know the motive for this. It's just going to be one of the facts that we have right now. And unless he left a note or there's something he left somewhere else, we may never know the motive.
One fan in the front row risking his life to save another.
That's just the blood from the guy I was giving CPR to.
Dimebag.
Right. I tried to help save his life. Do anything anybody else would do.
Police have identified the gunman as 25-year-old Nathan Gale of Marysville, Ohio. Gale died at the scene along with Abbott and 3 others. Police are now investigating if the gunman...
23-year-old Nathan Bray geared up to see Damageplan at the Alrosa Villa nightclub in Columbus, Ohio. It was December of 2004, and Bray had been a longtime fan of Pantera and was excited to see his idols on stage at the intimate club. He left his wife and young son at home and headed off to the club with a friend ready to take in a great show. As Damageplan took the stage, the opening riffs for Breathing New Life, a track from the band's freshman release Newfound Power, began to fill the small venue. Less than a minute into the performance, 25-year-old Nathan Gale stormed the stage, shooting Darrell Abbott multiple times in the head, putting a shocking end to one of heavy metal's greatest stories. As chaos erupted, Bray took to the stage, attempting to aid Darrell, and once he realized the extent of his injuries, turned his attention to Kat Brooks, who was also injured but survived, and was met with a hail of gunfire from Gale. Killing the young father there on a stage meant to entertain and heal, but instead would become traumatically infamous. 4 people were killed that night, with Abbott's head of security, Jeff Mayhem Thompson, and Alrosa Villa security agent Aaron Hulk meeting the same fate, before Officer James Niggemeyer heroically entered the nightmare and put an end to the carnage with a shotgun blast to Nathan Gale's head. This is one of heavy metal's most infamous stories, and I don't want to dive into it here, as it's something that I've done in the past with my video on the incident. But this, December 8th of 2004, is the true and undeniable end of Pantera. The aftermath of which saw the entire metal world in mourning, and it was something that they would have to cope with and accept. And with Pantera's closeness to their fan base, it seemed to hit especially hard. Tributes and a fitting funeral would take place, and the world would continue on, including Rex, Phil, and, most importantly, Vinnie Paul. Vinnie Paul Abbott never reconciled with Phil Anselmo after his flaming Metal Hammer interview, in which he stated that Dimebag deserved to be severely beaten. Perhaps, in some way, Vin placed some percentage of the blame on Phil, and while Anselmo attempted to defend himself, stating that the comments were tongue-in-cheek, Vinnie Paul was not convinced at all after hearing the audio tapes himself. The remaining members of Pantera would continue on with other projects, with Vinnie Paul eventually joining Hell Yeah with members of Mudvayne and Nothingface after continued courting. On June 22, 2018, at the age of 54, Vinnie Paul Abbott passed away in his Las Vegas home of heart-related conditions. In the years leading up, Vinnie Paul was consistently against any Pantera reunion without Darrell. The piece to take away from his death, for me at least, is that he's reunited, side by side with his brother and bandmate, back home in Texas. Currently, a Pantera tribute tour is taking place, with Ozzy Osbourne / Black Label Society guitarist Zakk Wylde and Anthrax / SOD drummer Charlie Benante, and the reception has been mostly positive from what I've seen. And while it does seem a bit off given Vinnie Paul's stance on any reunion leading up to his death, I think it's awesome to have a place where fans can gather and pay tribute to one of heavy metal's most iconic sibling duos. I've heard plenty of stories about fans meeting Dime and Vin and what an awesome experience it was. For 20 years, Pantera dominated stages and studios and changed the fabric of heavy metal itself, a feat that not many bands can be credited with. Pantera's story is one of legend, triumph, and tragedy like any good mythology. Its end is so severely unsatisfying that it turns your stomach but you have no choice but to accept. Personally, as a fan, I wish that I could deliver you a different ending, but alas, that's life, isn't it? From humble beginnings and rigorous grinding to eventual and continual success, this was the story of heavy metal's Cowboys from Hell. And I hope I've done it justice. If you've made it this far, I commend you. This was a long one, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have your own stories about Pantera, I would sincerely love to hear about them in the comments. If you'd like to support further, you can join the Patreon, where you'll be given early access to videos, podcast episodes, and future exclusive content. Remember to like and subscribe for more in the future, and if you're feeling really generous, tell your friends. Future unscripted Hawk and Load here. I wanted to step in and thank Varkenstad for providing all of the music in this video that isn't Pantera. The rest is all him. If you liked any of the music, all of his links will be in the description so you can check him out and check out the rest of his stuff, because I don't even think I used 10% of his library. It's all very good stuff. And he's going to be providing music for not only this video, but all of the videos moving forward. And a sincere thank you for that. If you want a deeper dive into the psychological elements in the tragic story of the death of Dimebag Darrell, you can check out the video on screen now. It was written for an audience of normies though, so it's full of cringy jokes that didn't land. I mean, in my opinion, I've done better. Remember to love your pets, and I will see you in the next video. Huge Patreon shout out to Daniel, Melissa, Jeremy, Richard, Gage, McLean, Weapon Son Gaming, Lisa, and Ryan. Doc and Sarge really appreciate the support.